All right, so we are in the book Mind Your Faith by Doy Moyer. We did run out of books. I've ordered more, so we will have more for anybody who wants one. But in the meantime, does anybody want to borrow one? I'm going to have the words up on the PowerPoint also, but if there's somebody who'd like to read along, just let me know. We've got one or two extras that we can lend to anybody who wants one to read along. Okay, all right, we're good. So we're going to finish up these final questions here on the introduction, and then we're going to move into chapter 1. I don't believe we're going to finish chapter 1 today. It's a little bit more lengthy than the preface and the introduction, but we're certainly going to get as far as we can. So we finished last Sunday morning at question 3 with our introduction. How do you think you can use these approaches in a positive way? And we really answered that in some of our discussion. The several different methods by which individuals and that Doy goes through describing how to approach somebody and talk to them about the Bible, whether you start with God and the existence of a creator, using evidences in nature, starting in the Bible, however it is you go about doing it. In the end, you have to start with where that person is. And I think that that's probably the best answer to question 3. We could go into the specifics of each one, but using these approaches, there's no one right way to go about talking to somebody as pertaining to those categories that Doy went through. Each one has strengths, but each one has weaknesses as well. And so ultimately, it all depends on where a person is in their knowledge, in their understanding of religion in general and of God in general, and then more specifically perhaps in the Bible. And really in a lot of ways question 4 pertains to that as well. Do you think there is an approach we should avoid? Why or why not? And again, these are not specific to just quote unquote Church of Christ ways of thinking or ways of presenting the gospel. This is very broadly utilized in Christianity. In fact, Joe asked the question last week about epistemology and Reformed epistemology. Epistemology has a long history. Epistemology is basically the study of knowledge, which would seem redundant, but it's basically the study of knowledge and the basis upon which we gather knowledge and what we base that knowledge on, whether we base knowledge on evidence, on our senses, what we observe, on our experience, that sort of thing. And Reformed epistemology, as close as I could get to a differentiation between epistemology and Reformed epistemology, is that Reformed epistemology tends to be more religious in its nature, whereas epistemology is all knowledge, no matter what it is. But also Reformed epistemology is broader in what it accepts as evidence. Epistemology, just your regular run-of-the-mill, is somewhat strict in its consideration of what evidence counts towards the accumulation of knowledge, whereas Reformed epistemology is much broader in what is under that category. So having said that, question 4, what is there an approach we should avoid? Ultimately, I think avoiding a very strict approach, you know how telemarketers, they have a script? Okay, no matter what you say, there's an answer for it in their script, generally speaking. And they will go by that script, and they're told that this script, more often than not, will lead to sales. All right? And I tend to think that going that route is the wrong approach in terms of having a script, quote unquote. Having a set, distinctive pattern in which you engage with every individual wouldn't necessarily seem to be the best approach, since each individual is going to be different. And each individual is going to have their own maybe experience with going to church, growing up, being taught certain ways, certain things. Everybody's going to have a basis of knowledge that is different. In fact, we see this. Now, we see some similarities with Paul and Peter and the other teachers of the gospel in the New Testament, where many of the things that they taught regarding the fulfillment of the prophecies to the Jews, for instance, was a lot of the things that they mentioned were the same, because that's going back to evidence. How they taught to the Gentiles, in a lot of ways, was the same. Establishing the Gentile gods, opening that up, for instance, Acts chapter 17 to describe the one true God. And so there are certain parallels and similarities that you see throughout all of them. But every situation is going to be different. And every situation may demand a different path or a different way of talking to somebody. And in that case, again, we could get specific in each one, but I tend to look at this the way Doy does in a broad overview. Is there an approach we should avoid? Yeah, strictly following just one approach, I think is what we should avoid. But instead, kind of taking into account an individual's needs of knowledge and understanding regarding God's Word, and not be limited to just one path or one way of talking to somebody. That I think would probably put us in a situation where we may not be able to adapt very well if somebody has an experience we haven't accounted for. Thoughts or questions through question 3 and 4? Yes, sir.
I agree with your premises there. On the flip side, we generally seem to be so timid or fearful or have a laundry list of excuses why not to talk to others.
Yeah.
But perhaps to get started, if you find one that I'm more comfortable with, I can get very versed on that. And,
Sure.
Maybe I can broaden out down the road.
That's true.
Yeah.
Especially if, and of course it all depends on maybe asking the most fundamental question, do you believe in God? Okay. That might be the most fundamental question that you can ask. And then based on what that answer is, there are different paths that we could take, different approaches that we could take to address whatever the answer to that may be. And so a lot of it may depend on kind of what you know about this person or what you've talked to with this person about just their basic knowledge. But that's true, that sometimes maybe if there's one particular approach we're most comfortable with, and we know that approach will be helpful to that person, then sticking with that approach may work. Sure. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, so let's move on to that. It is all, yeah. So the rest of these are the references that he made in this introduction. So let's move on to the chapter 1, faith and evidence. Okay. All right, so chapter 1, faith and evidence, and like I said, I'm putting the page numbers at the beginning of each page, so that everybody, if you're reading along, you can keep up, or want to go back and read something later, you can kind of know where it is generally on your page. So, starting with chapter 1, page 13. Faith is a key component of conviction. If we are convinced that something is true, then we trust, first of all, that our evidence or reason for believing is solid, and 2, that our reasoning abilities are sufficient to properly interpret the evidence, so that our conclusion is true, which is to say that our conclusion agrees with reality. So you've got two main things that you trust in. You've got the evidence, or the reason for belief is a solid reason, and that our reasoning abilities to interpret that evidence is solid and sufficient. If either the evidence or the reasoning process is faulty, then our faith has been misplaced, and our worldview will not accurately reflect reality. A sound worldview must be based upon truth. And this means that Christians, who are especially concerned with truth, and we should be, are also concerned about both the evidence and how they reason about that evidence. Thoughts or questions to this first paragraph? He's establishing basically the process by which we come to belief, and that conviction that this is true, this is in fact what is right. And he's kind of looking at the fundamentals of what that means. Yes, sir.
So maybe I'm not really understanding the Reformed epistemology, and I don't necessarily want to go back and review that whole lesson. But that paragraph talks about believing things without evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But now he's saying that faith is based upon evidence. I completely concur with that. I'm not so sure about the Reformed.
So there is a difference. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a difference between Reformed epistemology and fideism, or fideism. Fideism is the belief It's the conviction that I can believe in something that is completely unreasonable, and I have no reason to question it. If I believe that it is, simply because I want to believe that it is, there's no problem with that. Reformed epistemology doesn't take that route. It believes that, just like Joe mentioned, that you can have faith in something that doesn't require evidence to still make it a belief. And the differentiation there is that one, it suggests being gullible. Okay, fideism or fideism, however it's pronounced, it's kind of really being gullible. You can pretty much, you believe anything without any reason to do so. No eyewitness testimony, nothing. As opposed to Reformed epistemology, which is, it's the basis of, as long as the belief is reasonable, I'm not going to base, it's saying I'm not putting all my eggs in the evidence basket in order for me to believe something. In other words, I don't need Jesus to appear to me and talk to me in order for me to believe that Jesus is. I will put my faith in something such as eyewitness testimony. Okay, it's the idea that there doesn't have to be specific evidence for me to believe something. I'll believe it based on other evidence or secondary evidence or whatever, but there is a basis for it. Reformed epistemology is not saying that just believe what you want without a reason for it. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I hope that answers your question, Joe. And we can talk more about that as well if there are other questions.
Well,
But
it says belief in God does not require the support of evidence or argument in order for it to be rational. But the example he gives of this is awakening to an understanding of God through a sense or awe of nature. That is evidence. That's
evidence. Yeah. And I think what he's trying to expand upon is the fact that Reformed epistemology, it's the idea that there is a basis for it, but no, I say direct evidence. To me, nature is direct evidence. To me, the Word of God is direct evidence. But I guess maybe how some people would refer to direct evidence as seeing the miracles, for instance, seeing Jesus raised from the dead. When I looked at the Reformed epistemology, basically what it was saying was we don't need that type of personal eyewitness experience in order to believe in something that we believe is rational and reasonable. So putting our faith, for instance, in a creator because of what we observe in nature, that's reasonable. Whereas to others, that's not evidence. And so Reformed epistemology is a little bit more specific in terms of having a basis for its belief, but it doesn't have to be what other people contend is evidence, maybe is the best way to put it. What other people would recognize as evidence or would not recognize as evidence, we might, and we would, and that's okay, even if other people reject it. You know, other people see nature as a random chance over the course of millions of years. What we see is a creator and a designer. I don't know a better way to talk about that. And we can look more at that later if we need to. Nolan?
Well, just tying into what, going back to the questions at the end of the preface, that number 4, my answer was what approach to avoid is this Reformed epistemology, because it seems very abstract or ethereal.
Yeah.
As he says within the paragraph there, it's not something you argue them into believing.
Right.
For my mind, it's something you leave alone. It either happens or doesn't happen for that person.
So it's more based in experience.
Discussion with them isn't going to bring them to that point. You just say there's something within them naturally is going to be aroused. Someday they're going to have, I don't know. I guess I'm having difficulty, kind of as Joe's expressing, by how he defines epistemology in the workbook. It's this sense of awe that's within them. You can't argue with them to get them to that point. So
it's not something that you can just.
It's not to me. It's not an approach that I'm going to take out to people.
Right. Right. Well, and like you said, each one of these approaches is multifaceted In fact, if you look up Reformed epistemology as it pertains to religion, there's countless articles about what different elements are accounted for in Reformed epistemology that we don't even have even in the book. And so there's again, these are overviews of these. And so trying to pinpoint exactly the differences between this and that may be a little bit more involved in the definitions of each of these approaches.
Right, and I agree. He's just trying to summarize
Right.
thousands of pages or whatever other books, but about the closest I could get on to think I did on that one from his paragraph is someone being taken with a belief in God. Was the psalmist says, "Be still and know that I am God."
And no, yeah.
That's up to that person to calm down or relax or whatever and observe that or
Right.
be aware of that.
Right.
That's separate. I can't argue or beat them over the head to make them do that.
Right.
I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, one element of Reformed epistemology is observance by which we interpret evidence. In fact, that's one thing about observing nature, for instance, being taken with the existence of God in nature. Okay, I think Reformed epistemology it tends to be more based on what's observable as opposed to what you can hammer into somebody or talk to somebody about, is a better way to put that. And so, at least from that perspective, can we point out observations around us that help to establish that it would certainly make sense for this to have been designed this way? And absolutely, we can. And again, that's part of that picking different elements of each of these approaches. I completely agree. Reformed epistemology, on its own, would not be the best approach to talk to somebody strictly just going based on that, because even in and of itself, you can't really make an argument. It's based on what that person observes. And so it's difficult to do it that way. Lisa?
Yeah, I'm thinking more along the lines of someone else might try to use this on us.
Yeah.
You know, like, well, it's what I believe and you're not going to change that.
Yeah.
It's probably not an approach we're going to use.
I would hope not.
But we're going to run into people and we're just going to have to, okay, this is where they're coming from and they don't have a basis for, it's just their belief.
Right.
You know, if I said that wall was orange, you're not going to talk me out of that wall being orange.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's based in God, the Bible, or my eyesight.
Yeah.
You know, and again, like Roland said, I think he's just given us definitions of the different approaches that fall into the evidences or the
Epistemologies. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there are people out there. I mean, this isn't theology, but you know, the people that say the world's going to end on May 27th.
Right.
Okay, well, first off, I know it's not because you said that. But what are you basing your stuff in?
Yeah. Well, it's like the Earth is flat. Okay. And those approaches certainly would be. These aren't just theological, as Snoop mentioned. These aren't just theological approaches. This is how people approach any defense of anything. Earth is flat. Okay. Well, these would certainly apply in an argument such as that, or a debate such as that. And the basis of observation. In fact, you'll note that a lot of flat earthers, a lot of them fit into that category of Reformed epistemology because they observe a horizon, an end. They don't see the earth as round. They don't see this or that. And so they simply believe it's flat. And despite what secondary evidence may come to them, and by secondary I mean outside of their own senses, their own observation, they don't accept that as evidence. And so in a lot of ways, flat earth it fits very well into those approaches that we just talked about. Other thoughts or comments?
What they're seeing is still evidence.
It is. No,
That's where I'm having a problem with this. However, he does go on to say, in the same paragraph, believing God is not dependent upon theistic arguments. Now, if by this he means biblical evidence, I can concur with that people can come to an awareness of God.
Of Jehovah.
There again, though, from the Bible, the heavens declare
Right.
the glory of God. It's evidence.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on who perceives what evidence. And that's really what, in a lot of ways, epistemology is about, is how you perceive evidence. And whether or not this evidence is worthy to be considered factual or not. And so that kind of goes to understanding where a person is, what they're willing to accept or not accept in discussion. But, we see it in terms of evidence or not evidence. And I think what Doy's considering, or what he's expressing in some of these approaches, is that other people, there's first degree evidence, which is my own personal senses, okay, which again is still evidence, but that's kind of first-hand evidence. Second-hand evidence is what other sources are telling me, whether it's a Bible, whether it's pictures of space showing me the earth is round. That's secondary evidence. And so it's all based on what priority I put on what and how I define it. And that's kind of, and like Doy said, a lot of these, to understand them better, you kind of have to go and look at them expressly and understand all the ins and outs of each one of these arguments. And they are a little confusing because some of them backtrack on each other. But I think generally speaking, again, the overview is just kind of giving us an understanding of how some will take these approaches and use them against us. Some of it is how we can take these approaches and help others, and help us identify where a person's coming from. Okay, if a person only accepts what they see and they refuse to accept any outside sources, then their personal evidence, if they've never been in a plane or they've never done anything else, then their personal evidence may convince them, I don't know any flat earthers, but maybe you do, that convinces them the earth is flat. And maybe there's no convincing them otherwise because they won't accept secondary evidence. Yes, ma'am.
To me, this would be a person that says, I believe what I believe because I believe it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there is no way that you're going to change that.
Yeah.
Indwelling of the Holy Spirit, present day indwelling of
Yeah.
the Holy Spirit. It doesn't matter. They're not going to accept what the Bible says. They're not going to, they believe it because they believe it.
Yeah.
And no amount of evidence,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's observed or written or whatever, is
Well,
going to change that.
and they would turn around and say, my evidence for the indwelling of the Holy Spirit are these people roll around on the floor. Okay, that's my evidence that there is indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Now, we won't accept that as permissible evidence, but to them, that's evidence. That to them, that's proof. And even though we don't agree with that. So, but yeah, you're right, Snoop. Anything else? All right. Going into this next paragraph, the Bible teaches that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews 11, verse 1. Faith stands under hope as a foundation. Without faith, we cannot please God, verse 6. In this passage, we are told that we must believe, first of all, that God is, and second of all, God rewards those who diligently seek Him. This provides the basis for hope of the unseen. To be assured of what we hope for, we must be convicted about that which we cannot physically see, namely God, and the reward He has promised. This also means that we must use our reasoning abilities in order to have some kind of conviction about these unseen matters. In order to do this properly, we need a little better understanding of what we mean by evidence. We also need better understanding of the term faith. So he brings up Hebrews chapter 11, and of course Hebrews chapter 11 is kind of a fundamental definition of faith. We know that without faith it's impossible to please Him, but faith is the substance or the assurance of things hoped for. It is the evidence or conviction of things not seen. Notice that the Hebrew writer says, faith is the substance, faith is the evidence, or faith is the assurance, faith is the conviction. And it's all based in things hoped for and of things not seen. And so this is the point at which Doy says he's going to describe the fact that this isn't just a baseless belief. It's like believing in fairies or, something that completely is ridiculous to believe in, but believing it in any way, even though I have absolutely no basis upon which to believe it. As opposed to by a biblical faith, which is different than that. He goes on to say, this also means that we must use our reasoning abilities in order to have some kind of conviction about these unseen matters. In order to be convicted about something, I have to reason it out. It has to be logical to me to be convicted, to truly be committed to a belief in whatever it may be. And so in order to do this, we need to make sure we understand what we mean by evidence and what we mean by faith. Any thoughts or comments through that paragraph? Sometimes people disconnect faith from evidence. That is, if we ask for evidence, then we are somehow indicating a lack of faith, because faith should be able to stand on its own apart from any evidence. But this misunderstands the nature of faith and its relationship to evidence and reason. I think that's a really important point to make, because there are people in our society who are anti-religion, anti-faith in God, and they believe that anyone who believes in God does so because they're gullible, and they have absolutely no basis for anything that they believe in. But if we say we have evidence, or we base what we believe in evidence, it's not that that's not faith. In fact, the whole reason we have the Bible is to provide us a basis for faith. And so I think this is a very important point, that if we ask for evidence, somehow we're indicating a lack of faith, because faith should stand on its own, and that's not true. Faith and reason, this misunderstands the nature of faith and its relationship to evidence and reason. God expects us to use the reasoning abilities that He created in us. Faith and reason go hand in hand, because the reason and evidence that promotes faith all come from the hand of God. And I think that's a very important point. In fact, he's going to bring up two scriptures, two separate passages here that are going to kind of help to describe exactly what he's talking about regarding evidence. Snoop? Okay. Faith and evidence tied together. This is page 14. In order to see how the Bible ties faith and evidence together, consider the following passages. And so he mentions 1 John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. This is a passage we're all familiar with. In the context, Jesus has been raised from the dead and is appearing to his disciples. Thomas was missing on the first occasion and would not believe the other disciples when they told Thomas that they had seen Jesus alive. I go back and forth in terms of, some people call him doubting Thomas, some people condemn Thomas, and certainly Jesus, to a certain extent, he condemns Thomas for not believing. But, the other apostles got to see him and Thomas didn't. So I kind of feel sorry for him, because everybody else got to see him, but I didn't get to see him. But he's steadfast. I'm not going to believe unless I see him. Thomas, he would not believe what the other disciples told him. Thomas's attitude is seen in his reply, unless I see, I will not believe, verse 25. Jesus later appeared and told Thomas to see and touch. Do not be unbelieving, but believing, verse 27. Thomas responded, my Lord and my God, verse 28. The next three verses tell us the purpose of the Gospel of John. Jesus told Thomas, because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who do not see and yet believe. Verse 29. The question is, how do we believe if we have not seen? John answers, therefore many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Verse 30 and 31. Just because we have not seen something does not mean that no evidence exists for it. Many of us have not seen atoms, and only then, some do so, or can only do so with help. Yet we accept that they exist. In a court of law, jurors listen to testimony in order to ascertain the truth of the case. They were not witnesses themselves to the alleged crime. They wouldn't be on the jury if they were, but they consider the evidence and the testimony, often from eyewitnesses, then use their reasoning abilities to evaluate and determine whether or not the defendant is guilty. They did not have to see the events to be able to say beyond a reasonable doubt that the events did or did not happen a certain way. That is how evidence works in a court of law, with evaluating history and with respect to the Bible and Jesus Christ. Thoughts or comments through that? And I think that's a great point to bring up, that there are many things in our everyday secular world that people take not just on eyewitness testimony, but what some would define as secondary evidence, or evidence beyond myself, to base my trust or base my belief in. And I think that goes hand in hand with what we're talking about. Yes, ma'am.
One of my most joyful moments is when science backs up the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, I believe God created the heavens and the earth, the whole earth. God tells us to look out and you'll see his handiwork. You know, intelligent design has been proven through archaeology and geology and all kinds of things, you know. But I didn't have to see all of that or hear it to believe, but it adds to the evidence that my belief is
Right.
founded in the right thing.
Right, it's reassurance. You know, and it's interesting because with Samson, you know, I had not known that they had actually found the tombs of Samson and his father Manoah. And yet that just goes to show that even as far back as the Judges, the accuracy of the Bible continues to be shown in archaeology. And again, that didn't all of a sudden make me believe in the accuracy of the Old Testament or of Judges. It simply reaffirmed the fact that there's just another piece of evidence to show that when the Bible records something, it's recording truth. Okay? And to me, the tomb of Samson, that's just one more piece of the puzzle to show that that's the case. Nolan?
One of the things I see in this story involving Thomas is that we as individuals have a choice to believe or not.
Yeah.
It's not just a matter of if I keep piling up evidence, it's going to hit a tipping point that you're pushed over the edge and you have to believe it. Or, you know, there's some who haven't seen or won't see,
Right.
will believe. And you, Thomas, in your mind, set this that I have to see first, or
Right.
this has to happen, or that
Conditions.
condition.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just keeping that in mind in talking with other people. You know, we've talked in reference several times in class lately in our studies about Pharaoh's heart being hardened for other individuals, and I think that's kind of what this is. Thomas's heart was hardened, or he was set against, unless this one thing happened.
Right.
Circumstances were just right, or whatever.
You know, and that kind of is a contrast to situations like with the Bereans, whose minds, they were fair-minded, and they searched the scriptures daily to determine what Paul was saying was so. It wasn't a case where, unlike with the other Jews, where they were saying, you know, well, the Messiah or the anointed one that we read about in prophecy has to be a physical king. He has to kick Rome out of Judea. He has to reestablish the kingdom of David. And if that's not what you're presenting to us, we don't want to hear it. So they had already preconditioned themselves or predetermined that they weren't going to listen unless it appealed to what they had been taught all their lives. Whereas the Bereans, even though they may very well have been taught the same things, they were at least willing to go to Scripture and see whether or not what Paul was saying about prophecy and the fulfillment of prophecy actually aligned with what happened. And they found that it did. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I've got history to show me everything, right? In the Bible, and I totally believe the Bible is the inspired word of God. Thomas didn't have that,
Yeah.
and he had been told that many would come and try to distort the truth.
Mhm.
Plus, you know, we take resurrection as a fact. He's standing there.
Yeah.
And he walked the road with this man, and like the only person they had seen raised from the dead, I mean, maybe they saw more than the examples we have in the Bible, but
Yeah.
how do you raise yourself? Before it was miraculous, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that he was right, but I can see where he might be a little bit, is this real?
Yeah, I tend to call him pragmatic Thomas. You know,
This can't be.
right. Yeah, I think, and again, I agree with his assessment that he did say, unless I see him, I will not believe. Well, what if Jesus had chosen never to appear to Thomas as a result? You know, would eventually Thomas have yielded after he appeared to more people than just the apostles? Because we know he appeared up to 500 brethren at once, according to 1 Corinthians 15. So would Thomas eventually have softened his stance on that? But I agree that you kind of, on the one hand, you feel sorry for him because, you know, they were all in the midst of sorrow. They were grieving. Okay, and maybe they just all kind of shared a hallucination. Maybe they just thought they saw. Maybe they saw somebody who looked like Jesus. You know, there's a lot of different ways that Thomas could have rationalized. Well, why did they all think that? And you know, so I'm not. Jesus, he does to a certain extent condemn Thomas, but at the same time, from a human perspective, I understand to a certain extent where Thomas is coming from. Yes, ma'am.
To me,
Yeah.
He's having a hard time. Blessed are those who are never going to see,
Yeah.
but believe in the Scripture and Jesus and God. You know?
Well,
This is to bolster us.
it's funny that you mentioned that because John seems to utilize that as a springboard to describe the fact that eyewitness testimony should be believed. Okay? I mean, he uses that. John himself includes, there were many other things Jesus did, but these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God and believe you may have life in his name. Just like Thomas, he shouldn't have had to have and be an eyewitness to the resurrected Jesus in order to believe what was being reported to him. But at the same time, again, from a human perspective, I'm sure that was difficult for him. We, however, have the benefit of not just one person, not just two people, but hundreds of people throughout the New Testament. Their eyewitness testimony, their writings, the examples of them in the book of Acts that show that this is what happened. Anything else? All right, page 15. John said that Jesus performed signs that lead to belief, even for those who have not actually witnessed them firsthand. When we consider that evidence refers to the facts or signs upon which a conclusion can be based, and I like that definition. Evidence refers to facts or signs upon which a conclusion can be based. Then we can see how the Bible itself points to evidence on behalf of Jesus. Based upon that evidence, there is an expectation of a response of belief. If we can trust the testimony, then faith has been engaged and it is founded upon proper evidence. And of course, that goes back to some of the approaches, though, because all of this is based on the Bible being the true Word of God and being accurate. There are some people who reject the Bible outright as any type of proof of evidence because to them it's either written by man or it's been recorded and re-recorded so many times you can't count on it, which Doy talks about later on. But this goes back to those different approaches. Well, what happens if they're not even willing to look at a Bible because they just out of hand reject that the Bible has anything to do with what we need to know? Maybe they believe in God, but they don't believe in the Bible. And so some of those approaches then kind of help us to determine a path ahead if we're going to argue the existence of God or the existence of Jesus aside from the Bible to get them to the point where they can believe in the Bible, to get them to the point where they can believe in Jesus, the Son of God. All right, anything through that? Like I said, that definition of evidence I think is very important because it kind of helps that's a baseline definition for evidence. Number 2, Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 through 6. Jesus was in prison and he sent John. John was in prison. He sent disciples to Jesus and asked, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" Jesus' answer gives some insight into the nature of faith and evidence. "Go and report to John what you hear and see," Jesus says in verse 4. Notice that Jesus did not say, "You just have to believe," as if it did not matter what evidence he had given. Instead, Jesus pointed to what they could see and hear. This is evidence. In fact, I would even add to, of course, he's focused on simply the matter of evidence here, but I would even add to that when Jesus responded to those disciples of John, he actually referenced the lame being made whole, the deaf being made to hear, and so forth. And actually, it's connected to prophecy. What Jesus says is connected to prophecy and how God will bring that about. And so there's even the additional element of evidence beyond just what the signs that they saw, the fact that it was connected to God said this was going to happen, and here is this anointed one doing it. That just simply enhances that evidence. They could hear the teachings of Jesus and they could see what he was doing, and based upon that they had all they needed in order to know who Jesus was. In fact, even at one point when in the Gospel of John, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, I think it was, and they're questioning, who he says what he says and that sort of thing, Jesus says, "Hey, don't believe me. Believe the signs that I do." Okay, if the signs that I do are from God, then believe I'm from God. If not, then don't. But my signs, my works speak for themselves. You don't have to believe a word I say. See my works. They could observe the evidence by themselves. In fact, even in Acts chapter 4, do you remember what the Sanhedrin said regarding the healing of the lame man outside the temple in Acts 3? What did they say? What did they say about the miracle? That a notable miracle has been done. We can't deny it. Okay, there's direct evidence, and they even admitted verbally that a notable miracle has been done. And a logical, reasonable person, especially someone grounded in the Old Testament, should have known that any miracle must be of God. But do they come to that conclusion? No. No, they don't. And that's a great example of the rejection of evidence, even though it's staring you right in the face. They simply chose, just like Nolan mentioned with Thomas, he had conditions. And since this didn't meet their conditions of reestablishing their power and their authority and the Old Testament prophecies the way they wanted, they rejected it. And it's mind-boggling, but at the same time, if we're not careful, we can fall into the same traps, and we have to be careful not to do that. Let's see. They could hear the teachings of Jesus. Yeah. Okay, we finished that paragraph. Anything through this paragraph? Okay. Even though we do not see and hear Jesus in the same way they could, we have the testimony of those who did see and hear him. When that testimony is passed along, even in written form, then we still have evidence upon which we can draw conclusions, much like a historian would draw conclusions based upon ancient documents and testimony. Evidence is not lacking at all on behalf of Jesus. Digging deeper will show that evidence is plentiful, and it both informs and encourages our faith. I think it's interesting, he mentions the historian and the ancient documents and testimony, and that's virtually true, or that's true for virtually all historical documents, except for the Bible. It's amazing when you go through and you read articles about texts they discover, receipts they discover in these cities and so forth. This must have happened here, and they put all this stuff together. And they just take it at face value that this is really what happened. But then when they come to the Bible, it's all metaphorical, or it was all just a story to give people a sense of meaning. It's not historical in any way. And it really is a stark contrast when you see that in articles where they're accepting all this other evidence and all this other archaeology and saying, so we've learned something new in the history of the Roman Empire based on this fragment of a document. But then you've got thousands of pieces of evidence in the manuscripts of the New Testament alone, and that doesn't count as evidence. It's really fascinating, unfortunately. Anything else through that paragraph? Okay, we only have time, I think, to start this next paragraph. What is biblical faith? The common idea about faith is that it is belief without evidence, or believing something in spite of the evidence. This makes faith sound unreasonable, blind, and gullible. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up right here with biblical faith next Sunday. Lord willing, we'll finish chapter 1. We'll get through the questions for next Sunday as well. That'll be the plan. Thanks, everybody.